The courtroom air felt unnaturally cold, as if the walls themselves recoiled from the scene unfolding at the center. A woman, thin rain, damp, her clothes clinging like an apology, stood shackled between two deputies. Her hair, once military, tight, now fell loosely against her cheeks. People in the gallery whispered as she was led forward, their gazes sharp, unkind, and convinced they already knew her story. To them she was a trespasser, a vagrant, another homeless shadow who had wandered through the wrong doorway of society. But none of them knew what the judge was about to learn. Her body remained still, but there was a storm beneath her silence. Her breath trembled with exhaustion, not fear. She had endured fear before fear in the pitch, black corridors of abandoned cities overseas, fear in the weight of water pressing in on her lungs, fear in the cold muzzle of an enemy's rifle brushing. Her neck fear was an old companion. What terrified her now was humiliation, the kind of humiliation that happens when the world forgets who you once were. The prosecutor flipped through papers with the confidence of someone who expected an easy victory. She had been arrested sleeping inside a private warehouse seeking warmth, not trouble. A minor misdemeanor, but the kind that made the public smirk. Homeless woman breaks in for shelter. In their eyes, her life was already summarized in 5 careless words. Yet even now, her posture held a faint trace of disciplined shoulders squared, chin steady, gaze forward. And that contradiction unsettled a few of the observers. Something about her didn't fit the image they had built. Something in the way she stood, even in chains, suggested a quiet authority, as though beneath the worn fabric and tired eyes lived someone who had once commanded storms. When the judge entered, the room straightened with collective instinct. He was a man known for precision, controlled movements, controlled emotions, controlled justice. He scanned the courtroom the way one scans a battlefield, measuring angles, reading stances, weighing intentions. His gaze finally settled on the defendant, and paused. She did not lift her eyes. Shame had taught her to look downward. Sometimes it was easier than seeing what others believed of her. The prosecutor began listing the charges, her tone practiced and bored, as though reciting grocery items. But the judge wasn't listening. He was studying the woman's name on the case file, a name he had not heard in years, a name that once echoed through briefing rooms, heavy with maps and fear and impossible missions. The gallery noticed the judge's stillness. A brief hitch in breath, a faint tension in his jaw. Something had shifted, though no one could understand why. The woman shifted her weight slightly. Her ribs ached from sleeping on cold concrete. Her wrists bore red marks from cuffs worn too long. She had prepared herself for another quiet defeat. Another day swallowed by a system too busy to remember sacrifices made in silence. But then the judge said her name aloud, not the way officials say it, flat and obligatory. He said it with recognition, with history, with the restrained awe of someone who had once read her file and wondered how a single human being could survive what she had survived. And in that moment, the woman finally lifted her eyes. The judge's expression, usually carved from stone, broke, just slightly, but enough for the room to feel it, an invisible, electric shift, as though something sacred had been uncovered after years, buried beneath dust and neglect. He rose slowly from his chair. The courtroom froze. Even the deputy stiffened, because the judge never stood. Not for lawyers, not for officers, not for officials. He only ever stood for one thing, honor, and all at once the whispers evaporated. The gallery fell silent. The prosecutor's confidence crumbled into confusion. For the first time in years, the woman felt the faint warmth of recognition, not for what she had become, but for who she truly was. A name that once carried the weight of a nation. A name spoken only in rooms with locked doors. A name that did not belong to a homeless trespasser, but to one of the most decorated women in the history of the naval special warfare community. But no one, not even the judge, was prepared for the truth that was about to surface. The silence after the judge stood was unlike any quiet the courtroom had known. It was not merely the absence of sound, it was the presence of realization. Something invisible pressed against every chest, urging breath to stillness. Eyes widened, not out of respect, but out of confusion. People strained to understand what they had missed, what truth hid behind the worn clothes and tired posture of the woman before them. She looked back at the judge, her gaze steady but hollow, like someone who had forgotten the shape of her own worth. The chains at her wrists felt heavier, almost mocking. Once she had rappelled down the side of a burning embassy with only a rope and instinct. Once she had swum miles through midnight waters with lungs screaming and enemies hunting. Once she had led men twice her size into shadows where only ghosts dared walk. And now cold metal defined her. The judge exhaled slowly, almost reverently, as if saying her name had summoned a ghost he thought long gone. He remembered it clearly, mentioned in briefings whispered between commanders, mentioned in citations classified beyond clearance, mentioned in stories spoken by those who had survived because she had refused to die, yet there she stood, a woman worn down by life, alone, forgotten. He lowered himself back into his seat with a trembling breath. "Proceed," he said quietly, though even the word felt wrong, too small for what he had just discovered. The prosecutor hesitated, confused by the judge's shift in demeanor. She glanced at the woman again, suddenly uncertain. "Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing." But the judge raised a hand, silencing her, not harshly. Softly, with the firmness of a man who understood gravity, "I have a question for the defendant." The woman stiffened. Questions from judges were rarely good. "State your full service designation." The prosecutor blinked. "Your Honor, that's irrelevant to—" "It is extremely relevant," he said, though his tone never rose. His voice carried the weight of quiet authority, the kind that did not need volume to command. The woman hesitated. A part of her wanted to lie, to avoid reopening doors she had boarded shut. Another part, the part that used to stand unflinching in chaos, refused to speak untruth. Her voice emerged rough, low, worn by years of disuse. "Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hale, Naval Special Warfare," she swallowed. Retired, the gallery stirred, not loudly, not explosively, just a subtle shift, like the air being sucked out of a room. People who had mocked her mere minutes ago now blinked in disbelief, recalibrating their assumptions. The judge's eyes softened, memories flickering through them like distant fires. He had never met her, but he had read enough classified reports to understand what she represented. Even her existence had been buried under layers of secrecy. Meanwhile, Evelyn's heart tightened. She hated this, hated the attention, the stirring curiosity, the sudden reverence. She had once been an operator trained to disappear. Now she felt exposed, as if the courtroom lights were stripping away the fragile walls she had built to survive her descent into homelessness. "Your record," the judge murmured, almost to himself, "is extraordinary." She didn't respond. She had never sought praise. The only people whose opinions mattered were the ones who never made it home. The prosecutor, sensing her case crumbling, tried to regain footing. "Your Honor," regardless of who she was, the judge's voice deepened, not angry, but wounded by the implication. "Some identities are not erased by circumstance." The woman lowered her gaze again. She hated pity. It was heavier than judgment, judgment she could endure, pity carved at her at the time of arrest. The prosecutor continued stiffly. "She was trespassing. That remains a fact. A fact." A simple fact. Evelyn almost smiled at the absurdity. She had survived missile strikes, kidnappings, ocean storms, and now her greatest crime was seeking warmth on a night too cold for broken bones and old scars. Her stomach tightened as she remembered that night, the wind slicing through her thin jacket, the rain soaking her blankets. the ache in her ribs flaring with every shiver. She had slipped into the warehouse simply because it was dry. She hadn't stolen. She hadn't damaged anything. She had just been tired, too tired to keep pretending she wasn't falling apart. The judge studied her quietly. He saw the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the hollow ache beneath her silence, the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but lingers like a shadow that refuses to fade. "Lieutenant Commander," he said gently, "how long have you been without stable housing?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She didn't want this. She didn't want the courtroom's sympathy or their shock. Still, the truth escaped her lips in a whisper that trembled with both strength and defeat. 3 years, the words hung like frost in the air. 3 years, the judge's expression cracked. The gallery fell completely silent. Even the prosecutor's breath stilled, because no one expected that, not from someone like her, not from someone who once served in the shadows to protect people who would never know her name. And for the first time in the entire proceeding, a quiet, piercing question settled into every heart present. How could a nation let someone like her fall so far? The judge's question lingered in the courtroom like drifting ash, settling on every mind and making the air feel heavier than before. Some people in the gallery shifted in their seats, embarrassed by their earlier whispers. Others kept staring at Evelyn with a new, unsettling awareness, as if they were seeing a crack in their own assumptions rather than in her life. Evelyn's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, but her mind roamed far from the courtroom. 3 years was the answer she had given, but it wasn't simply a measure of time. It was a collection of nights where sleep came only in trembling fragments, of mornings where her breath hung pale in the cold and her willpower felt thinner than her clothes. It was the ache of being invisible to a society she had once bled to defend. The judge inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had presided over cases involving generals, senators, decorated officers, and ordinary citizens. Yet he had never felt the kind of moral fracture now spreading through his chest. He remembered the stories he had heard of her, stories sealed behind black bars of censorship. How she had once guided civilians through collapsing tunnels. How she had held the line alone while her team evacuated wounded soldiers. How she had survived moments where survival had been mathematically impossible, and now she stood before him in chains. A woman punished not for violence but for seeking warmth. He closed the file softly, his hand resting on it as though protecting something fragile. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice low, "why did you not seek assistance through the VA or any veterans' resources?" A question so simple it felt cruel. Evelyn's breath shook, not from fear, but from the memory of doors she had knocked on, and the ones that never opened. "I tried," she whispered, "but paperwork moves slower than cold." She lifted her eyes briefly, and some wounds don't show up on forms. The judge felt that sentence like a blade turned inward. The prosecutor swallowed, the confidence draining from her posture. She sensed the case slipping through her fingers, but more than that, something in her conscience stirred a quiet discomfort she couldn't quite place. She had prosecuted hundreds of minor trespass cases, each one routine. But now she wondered how many stories she had overlooked, how many lives she had flattened into lines of text and legal accusations. One of the deputies shifted beside Evelyn, his grip on her arm unconsciously softening. He was young, too young to hide his emotions. His eyes flickered with guilt. His own brother was in the service. Evelyn felt the room's sympathy pressing toward her like unwanted heat. She had never craved it. Sympathy was a luxury she had been trained to ignore, yet she couldn't deny a small, fragile part of her that longed, just once, for someone to see her without judgment. "I don't need special treatment," she murmured softly. "I just didn't want to die out there." That sentence cracked something open in the judge's chest. It was not dramatic, not loud, not desperate. It was a simple confession from someone who had endured more than most humans ever will. He leaned back, steadying the tremor in his hand. His thoughts drifted to the countless ceremonies he had attended, where soldiers were honored after they had already fallen. How many times had he watched flags being folded with precision, while families stood in stunned grief? He had always wondered why recognition so often arrived too late. The prosecutor cleared her throat, almost whispering now. "Your Honor, the trespassing charge still stands legally, but in light of—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "In light of who she is, the state is prepared to consider a minimal penalty," but even she knew how hollow that sounded. The judge shook his head slowly, not in disagreement with her tone, but with the entire situation. "This is not about minimal penalties," he said gently. "This is about justice." He turned his gaze toward Evelyn again. "Your service record reflects sacrifices that cannot be repaid. But more than that, it reflects a woman who has endured far beyond what she should have been asked to bear." Evelyn bit the inside of her cheek, steadying herself. She didn't want gratitude. She wanted dignity. Something shifted in the gallery, a quiet stirring of shame, of awakening. People who had walked into that courtroom believing they understood homelessness now felt the weight of ignorance pressing on them. They realized how quickly society decides who is worth compassion and who is not. The judge reached for his pen, but halfway down his hand paused. A memory rose in his mind, a briefing long ago, a line in a classified report mentioning her name. A commander had described her with one sentence: "If she ever falls, we all lose something irreplaceable." Looking at her now, he finally understood. He set down the pen, folded his hands, and breathed deeply. "Before I make any ruling," he said slowly, "I need to know one thing." Evelyn lifted her eyes, bracing herself. "Why did you leave the service?" The room froze again. It wasn't a legal question. It wasn't procedural. It was human. It was the question everyone subconsciously wondered, but no one dared ask. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly against the cuffs. Pain flickered behind her eyes, old pain, deep pain, the kind she had buried so far inside that speaking it felt like reopening a wound no one could see. She looked at the judge for a long moment, then whispered a truth that would change everything in the room. "I didn't leave." Her voice cracked. "I was left behind." The judge's breath caught. The gallery murmured in confusion. But no one, not even Evelyn, was prepared for what that revelation meant. Her words drifted through the courtroom with the slow, devastating weight of truth. "I was left behind." They were not dramatic. They were not accusatory. They were simply honest, so honest that the silence following them felt almost sacred. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the room itself understood the gravity of what she had finally allowed herself to say. The judge leaned forward, not out of authority now, but out of human instinct, like a man trying to hear the heartbeat of someone who had nearly drowned. "Left behind," he repeated softly, not pressing, not demanding, simply receiving. Evelyn swallowed hard. Memories clawed their way upward, ones she had buried under years of cold nights and silent suffering. She had never spoken about the mission publicly. It had been sealed, classified, forgotten by everyone except the ghosts who visited her in dreams. "There was an operation," she began, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "Deep reconnaissance, high-value extraction." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the chain, as if grounding herself. "We were compromised. Communications failed. Evac window closed sooner than scheduled." She paused, breath unsteady. "My team assumed I was gone." The prosecutor's eyes widened. Not in skepticism, no. One in that room doubted her, but in horrified understanding. Evelyn stared ahead, seeing not the polished wood of the judge's bench, but the burning ruins of a foreign compound, the echo of distant artillery, the cold dirt beneath her palms as she crawled. "Through darkness alone I made it out," she whispered, but by the time I resurfaced, the world had already moved on. The gallery felt the ache of that sentence. To survive a mission only to return to silence, no welcome, no acknowledgement, no place was a cruelty few could imagine. "You were never debriefed," the judge asked quietly. She shook her head. They thought they had buried me, and I didn't correct them. Her gaze hardened with the weary resolve of someone who had carried too much for too long. Some things you survive physically, but not entirely. The judge closed his eyes briefly. The pieces were falling together, a woman trained to endure the impossible, abandoned by bureaucracy, forgotten by the systems that should have protected her. She had not drifted into homelessness. She had been pushed, inch by silence, trauma, and a nation too distracted to notice. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them, not pity, not shock, something deeper, a promise forming quietly within him. Before he could speak, a voice from the gallery broke the silence. A man in his early 40s rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. His eyes were wide, searching Evelyn's face with the intensity of someone recognizing a ghost. One of the deputies instinctively stepped forward, ready to silence any disruption, but the man choked out, "Your Honor, I'm sorry, but I know who she is." Every head turned. "I served," the man continued, his voice cracking at the edges. "Different unit, same command chain. Stories about her, they traveled everywhere. She was the one they said never gave up. The one who walked people out when there wasn't a path left. She saved lives none of you will ever hear about." He looked at Evelyn as if she were something sacred and aching. "We thought she died a hero." Evelyn's throat tightened. She didn't want reverence. She didn't want legends. They hurt more than they healed. The judge lifted a hand gently, signaling the deputy to let the man remain standing. "Thank you," he said, but his gaze stayed on Evelyn. "But the woman before us is not a legend. She is someone who needs justice now." Evelyn looked down again, her composure trembling under the weight of so many eyes. She had stood unflinching before fire and death, but this, being seen, felt harder. The judge spoke slowly, every word steady and deliberate. "Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hale," he paused, letting the title settle into the room. It felt right, like restoring a name that had been rusted by time. "This court will not punish you for seeking warmth, safety, or survival." The prosecutor exhaled, relief softening her posture. Even she knew this was the only righteous outcome. The judge continued, "The trespassing charge is dismissed in its entirety." A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. Not dramatic applause, not triumph, just a release of collective tension. But he wasn't finished. He folded his hands and leaned forward. His voice weighted with purpose. "This court is ordering immediate coordination with Veteran Support Services to provide you with housing, medical care, and trauma resources, effective today. Evelyn's breath caught." It wasn't victory. It wasn't charity. It was something she had almost forgotten existed, a lifeline. Her vision blurred slightly, memories slamming into her store, written nights under a bridge, the sharp crack of frost along her skin, the loneliness that hollowed her. She blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall. The judge's voice softened. "You were left behind once. You won't be left behind again." The gallery stayed silent, not out of indifference, but respect. A few bowed their heads unconsciously. The man who had stood lowered himself back into his seat, his eyes still shining. Evelyn lifted her gaze at last. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her, not as an inconvenience, but as a human being. The judge nodded gently, almost imperceptibly. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant Commander, with honor." As the deputies removed her cuffs carefully, respectfully, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. The faint, trembling beginning of a future. Not a heroic one, not a legendary one, just a human one. And for a woman who had survived the impossible, that was more than enough.